Hello. Hi, everybody. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to AI and the Creative Writing Life, a panel discussion. My name is Jennifer Jean, and I'm the Senior Program Manager of 24PearlStreet, which still has a host of poetry and prose workshops remaining this fall season. I want to tell you about first before we begin everything. These are taught by award-winning faculty such as Jennifer Franklin, Martha Collins, Emily Niemans, and Nathan McLean. Nathan McLean will be hosting our final community event of the fall, which is our student open mic night, and you can receive information about that free event by signing up for our newsletter. We'll be putting the newsletter information in the chat, so look for that. This newsletter lets folks know about our special discounts, like our 20% off student and teacher discount, as well as many other Fine Arts Work Center opportunities. Tonight's panel is predicated on the idea of Chesterton's fence, which suggests that when new ideas and technologies are introduced, it's best to take time to understand why things exist as they do currently, and that it's best to take time to game out or guesstimate what would occur as a result of novel notions and additions. This panel discussion is not meant to be comprehensive, but instead to begin, and in some cases continue, a conversation about new tech that affects the art and vocation of writing. All right, so the way things are going to proceed is that I will ask the panelists questions in alphabetical order, generally speaking, to start, and then we'll let the conversation develop as we move along. This is in order to generate this discussion and to see what comes out. None of us here quite knows what will happen, and that's what makes this an exciting time and also an exciting event. I'll chime in as needed, but my hope is to be the facilitator of this great conversation. As we proceed, feel free to post your questions in the chat. I also encourage our panelists to post useful links in the chat, as they come to mind. In the last 15 minutes of the event, right around 7:15, we'll take questions from the audience. And when we do that, you'll be raising your hands using the function at the bottom of your Zoom page, and we'll put instructions in the chat at that time. Okay, so I'm going to introduce everyone at once so you can get to know everyone, and then we'll begin. So to start, we have Oliver De La Paz, who is the author and editor of 7 books, including The Diaspora Sonnets, which was a winner of the 2023 New England Book Award and longlisted for the National Book Award. He is the Poet Laureate of Worcester, Massachusetts, and teaches at the College of the Holy Cross and in the low residency MFA program at Pacific Lutheran University. And then we have Katie Dozier, who is a professional poker player and advocate of NFT poetry, as well as the curator of the NFT Poetry Gallery. She is the author of Watering Can and co-author of Hot Pink Moon with Timothy Green, which I believe is a recent publication. She hosts the weekly podcast, The Poetry Space, is the haiku editor for One Art, and is an editor at Rattle Magazine. And then we have Keith Holyoak, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at UCLA and is a leading researcher in the field of human thinking, as well as a poet. His scientific work combines behavioral investigations with both cognitive neuroscience and computational modeling of cognition. He is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books of cognitive science, including The Spider's Thread, Metaphor, In Mind, Brain, and Poetry, and The Human Edge, Analogy, and the Roots of Creative Intelligence. He has also published a volume of his translations of classical Chinese poetry, which I really want to check out, as well as 4 volumes of his own poetry. And very briefly about me, my poetry collections include Vaux's Object Lesson and The Fool. I've co-translated forthcoming bilingual collection Where Do You Live with Iraqi poet Dr. Hana Ahmed as well. I've edited forthcoming anthology Other Paths for Scheherazade, a bilingual anthology of poetry by Arab women. In addition to my work with the Fine Arts Work Center, I'm faculty member at the Solstice Low Residency MFA program. Okay, so now you know who we all are, roughly. And now I'm going to begin. And the question that I want to start with is, what do you mean when you talk about AI? And I want to start with Keith Holyoak. I want to start with Keith and let us know, what do you mean when you talk about AI?
Okay, well, I sort of come at this, at least in part, as a cognitive scientist, sort of broadly interested in human intelligence and how it could be captured in computer systems. So, in very broad strokes, AI, artificial intelligence, is kind of the enterprise of trying to make computers do things that we humans would consider intelligent, sort of emulating all our skills, basic ones like vision, and of course now language and problem solving, et cetera, et cetera. And AI has many manifestations. You can probably trace it back, let's say, 80 years to Alan Turing in the mid 1940s, who kind of launched it and left us with things like his concept of the Turing test, which is basically a hypothetical test where you see whether a computer can fool a human observer into thinking that it is a human. But in terms of what we probably want to be focusing on today, the main brand of AI is the large language models. So I'll kind of, you can roughly talk about ChatGPT, which probably everyone's heard about. And there's many other variants, but they're kind of all the same. And this is sort of a great leap forward that happened right around the end of 2022. So these AI models are focusing on language. I should add, as you probably know, more generally, there are AI models that do things like generate pictures and faces and all kinds of visual stuff. And there's also multimodal models that combine language and vision. But if we're focusing on creative writing, probably the most pertinent ones are kind of the original large language models. So they're a very large neural network where every word that comes in would be given a kind of feature representation. It might have like 1,000 numbers that essentially stand for that word. There's connections from every feature to other features in another layer above. And the fundamental objective that they're taught on is to predict the next word that's coming in. So important to realize that they're not doing anything like what we might think of as normal human reading, where you're reading words and understanding them and answering questions. Or they're just taking in text with the last word blotted out, and they're predicting what word should fill that blank. And the things that make them work are, first of all, the networks are extremely large. These connections total on the order of 1 trillion these days, approximately. The text that they're trained on is essentially every scrap of text, computer code, or anything alphanumeric that OpenAI and other companies can get their hands on, which you can roughly think of as the entire internet. So stage one, you train it through many iterations to do the best it can at predicting next words. There's then a kind of a follow-up called reinforcement learning with human feedback, where you start asking it questions. A human looks at the answer and basically says, yes, that's a good answer, or no, that's a bad answer. And you update these parameters some more. At that point, the model's basically frozen, and that's where it would be like put out on the internet for users to take hold of. So a user might do what's called fine tuning. So, for example, if you're particularly interested in the style of a particular writer, you might feed the system lots of examples of what that writer has written. So a lot of this, of course, it will have already seen, but you could give it a special focus on something. That's called fine tuning. And then you start asking questions. This is what are called prompts. And in some ways, this is the most kind of miraculous aspect, or at least at first blush, is you can ask it anything. So although it was only trained to predict the next word, you can now put in a string of text and it will act as if it interprets that as an instruction, as a question. You can give it examples of the sort of thing you want it to do, and then have it respond. You can then give it further feedback that you would like something changed. So you can essentially use it to generate answers. And because it's generative, of course, it leads to the question of, can it generate something creative, including potentially creative writing of various sorts. So anyhow, I guess that's hopefully enough to kind of at least set the stage and sort of what AI is today.
Yeah, that's fantastic and very thorough. Thank you. And I really appreciate how you connected AI and isolated it, the discussion and definition so far to the creative writing life, which is what everyone here is concerned with. So I'm going to throw things over to Oliver, and yeah, tell us what you mean when you say AI and what you think about it.
Sure. So I am going to first apologize because I can see my bars going up and down. I noticed that they're going from yellow to red, so I may drop out. Just giving you a heads up. In that, if that happens, I'll circle right back. I just came from a English department meeting prior to coming here to speak with you. And one of the topics that we talked about actually was the use of AI in the classroom. And one of the things that my colleagues found was that a number of our students were, in fact, using AI to write papers. A number of people were, in fact, using it to sort of, cheat or hurry or expedite the process of creative writing. And I will say that, as a humanist and as somebody who comes from the humanities, AI and the concept of AI is both the devil and the angel on my shoulders. I think on the one hand, I can see its use.
Okay, I think that we did lose Oliver. Let's see if he comes back.
Did you lose me?
He left us on a cliffhanger.
Jennifer, we can hear.
Yeah, he's still here for me.
Yeah.
And for me. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
then
here
it's
for
just me.
As I was saying,
then I'm the frozen one.
I think of AI as the devil. Yeah, you're the frozen one. I think of it as the devil and the angel on my shoulder, as I had said. And as far as the use of it as a tool, I find it has great potential for helping folks in terms of neurodivergent folks who might need assistance or aids. I know, in fact, my own sons who are neurodivergent use it and find it to be a very, very helpful tool, particularly when it comes to note-taking. And in fact, my school at Holy Cross, we're actually pioneering the wide use of Glean, which is an AI note taker. So in terms of a tool and a valuable tool at that, I think there's certainly potential as a means towards the production of creativity and creative activity. I'm not concerned, but I'm also somebody who is I don't know, skeptical. I have been one of those people who has logged on to ChatGPT and told ChatGPT, write a poem in the style of Oliver de la Paz and see what happens. And let me tell you, I'm still a pretty good writer. And I don't think that ChatGPT can shake a stick at what it is that I do. But I mean, I think that one of the things that I have to say about this endeavor as we go into thinking about AI is that I still believe that humanity and people value each other's company. And I think that in terms of the space of art making, why we value art and the ideas behind the art that we create is that we know that there is a human mind behind it. At least we think we know that there is a human mind behind it. And that, in that sense, I think that in terms of AI for writers in this critical crisis that we might be in, I still think that there is, the primacy of human contact. I think that sort of supersedes all of this fear.
I think Jennifer's actually. Oh, are you back, Jennifer? Great.
I'm back. Oh, goodness. The tech overlords are not happy with me, I think, today. In any case, thank you, Oliver. And I'm going to throw things over to Katie.
Oh, thanks so much. So I'm obsessed with metaphors, not only because I'm a poet, but because I'm obsessed with haiku. And so I was trying to think about, well, if I was looking at large language models and AI and trying to find a metaphor, how would I visualize that? And what I came up with, which is probably imperfect because it occurred on a car ride on the way back home today, is thinking about it as a trampoline. So we prompt a large language model, ChatGPT, most likely. And then that allows us to get a trampoline where we can bounce in any way off of it. And it's up to us to make the movement, but we do get the trampoline that we can use. And I like to think about AI in 3 different ways. I like to think about it as generative AI. So that is generating text based on prompt, which is most commonly, I think, what people are thinking about when they think about using ChatGPT. And then there's also analytical AI, where we can input our own work as creative writers and get feedback potentially on that, which is really exciting too. And then third, there is this idea of collaboration with AI, which I think is really exciting too. But in summary, I feel extremely positively about AI. And I really think the potential to make us better writers is the most important part of this.
I like that. So the thing that I wanted to share about, and this plays off of what you just said, Katie, and also the last thing that you were talking about, Oliver, which is about the human behind the text, as well as the, Katie, what you were talking about, the opportunities, for improvement. When I've used AI is when I've worked with with translation. Right now, I work with co-translation teams, working with women from the Arab diaspora, and they're all poets, and most of them only speak Arabic. I only speak English, so we work through a co-translator, a non-poet, generally speaking. And so I represent poetry in English in this configuration. So one thing that's happened quite often when I'm doing this co-translation is that I'll plug in the Arabic into like Google, or I just have a set of different translation models that I plug the Arabic into, and then I see what it says, because sometimes we're working over Zooms in different time zones, and I've needed to move things along. So I just check just so I can get going. But I've often asked the co-translator as well as the original poet, what do you think about what tech came up with? And they often don't like it, actually. Or sometimes they say, if I ask a question in a certain way, maybe something like, does this word mean knife? And then they say, you checked that in tech, didn't you? Like, they can tell that I did. And it could be that these models that I'm using are just not up to snuff yet. They just need a little bit more work. That's something I've been considering, and maybe as time goes on, they'll improve. But also, I just think that I personally wouldn't want to rely on the tech when I'm translating, even if things were able to improve, because language is in motion very often. And one thing I've learned working in the entire with women from the entire Arabic diaspora, that's about 22 nations, that it's all Arabic, but it's not all Arabic. There's different, and we're not even talking about dialects, but just an understanding of a particular word and the way they use it, especially in poetry. It just gets really granular, and even someone who's born on the same block as that poet would, live their whole lives there the same way, would interpret the word differently, just like we all who speak English, that can be the case, and that poetry just has that kind of flexibility. It can really flex a lot before it breaks. If it even breaks at all, it can just really be very flexible. So I felt that with translation, it's useful, and it's helpful. And especially in talking with one translator, he talked about dead languages, or languages which are they're threatened with extinction because people aren't speaking them or translating them into more dominant languages, and they're just dying out. So it can be useful in that way. There's a utility there. However, with this co-translation experience, which is a very human experience, is about creating relationship and friendship and cross-cultural understanding. And so there's a lot going on there with these co-translations teams I've been a part of, especially. It's just useful, but I really feel like it can't substitute. So I like the idea of the human behind it, the story behind the creature that created a creative work of art. But and also I like the utility side of it and the opportunity for improvement. So that's my take on it. And I wanted to bring that in because a lot of people don't think about translation when they think about AI, but it's huge there because, as you know, you can now have your phone and just speak into it, and then it writes out in the other language, and you just show the other person. It can even speak it in their language, and then you can have this conversation. That I don't have that app, but I know it exists. All right, so we're going to move on to the next question, and definitely tell me if I freeze up because that was really embarrassing. All right, so let's move on to, and we're going to go in the alphabetical order this time so I can keep it straight in my head. How is AI affecting creative writers and the process of creative writing from what you've seen in the world? So there's just a lot of anecdotal stuff is fine, but maybe if you know studies, that's fine too. But how is AI affecting creative writers? And Oliver talked a little bit about this, but also the process of creative writing. And we will start with you, Oliver.
So I have a few friends who have actually decided to pull any of their postings from spaces like Instagram, Facebook, what was formerly known as Twitter, and other spaces like that, mostly out of the fear that their work would be swallowed up by the machine and then spat out in some way, shape, or form, plagiarized, if you will. So, I mean, I know that's actually a very real thing, that writers are doing that actively, pulling all of their written work offline, or also just choosing not to publish in online periodicals specifically for this reason, because they're frightened by the algorithm. I am not one of those people. I just want to sort of put that out there, that I'm not necessarily one of those people. I'm not necessarily afraid of that, because I think that poetry is not just the generative part, right? Like just creating the poem and then having it up for publication. I think that there are other things that are essential to this idea of art and art making. But I think that there's a very real reaction in the community. I know that, of course, like part of the Hollywood strike involved writers who were very, very concerned about, their intellectual property being taken by a computer or machine and then spat back out. And then I think a lot of, even actors and actresses have signed off against this particular technology because they're afraid that their images and likenesses will be CGI'd into these particular mediums. So, I mean, I think that creatives, there is a real fear in the creative community about what AI is and what it can do in terms of intellectual property. I think, though, that right now, it's very much a young technology, I would say, in some regards. I think that people are learning about what it can do, what it is capable of doing. And I think eventually artists will figure out how to use it to their advantage. I think it's just a matter of time. But right now we're in this unknown phase, I feel.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Katie, what do you think?
Well, I'm unusually going to bring poker into this discussion, which is because I started playing poker and I preferred to play online, right? And so I was just playing, and then this was quite a while ago now. But what happened was people developed software that could analyze your poker playing and mathematically prove if what you were doing in the long run was correct or incorrect, and by how much, by what percent. And there was initial real resistance to this idea, like, oh, it's going to kill poker. That did not happen. And what it did was it gave the players that really wanted to be as good as they possibly could this whole, set of tools that they didn't have access to. Now, that didn't mean that I would always make the mathematically sound decision. The goal is to become good enough that you can beat the math, so to speak, which sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. But I'm reminded of that because the way the community feels and our skepticism, which is fair, skepticism about AI feels very similar. And for me, I feel that using it as a tool for creative writing gives us a massive advantage over everyone who has come before us in a similar way. I think part of it is that in creating the prompts, so it's a skill to create a really good prompt for ChatGPT, right? And personally, I view it like a game. I think it's really fun to try to get better at prompting ChatGPT. But what's amazing about that is in prompting the ChatGPT to go ahead and give us something back that makes sense, we're having to critically analyze our own thought process in terms of putting that down. So maybe it begins to mirror my internal thought process of, oh, I'm going to sit down to write a poem. And I guess there's some sort of something that pops into my head right before then, right? And I'm able to more clearly put that out there because of it. And then also, what I love about the ability to make us better creative writers is how we get to be critical of ChatGPT's response, right? It is fun to go ahead and do that. Actually, we were in my electric car and we were using the auto drive for the first time. And it is fun to be like, man, Tesla, you shouldn't have turned like that or something, right? It's fun to be able to be critical sometimes of something that we're not hurting their feelings. So the wonderful thing about that is in being critical of ChatGPT's output, like, oh, it really wrote this sentence awful or whatever, it's empowering because then guess what? We can do that to our own writing without maybe feeling as bad about ourselves. Like we're not perfect writers either. So being able to see both sides of the prompt is really a creative exercise in and of itself that has value. So I think that all of those things are wonderful. I mean, the potential for it is just so immense, being able to collaborate, like Oliver was saying earlier, inputting your own poetry and having ChatGPT try to write in your style, and that can be fun, or trying to get ChatGPT to roast your poetry if you're feeling a little bit down. And then lastly, I think I'm a big believer that there's no such thing as writer's block, which I think some people hate to hear. But I think that particularly in the world of ChatGPT, where you can go and say, hey, give me a poetry prompt, there's no such thing as writer's block almost anymore.
Certainly. That's great. Yeah. Go ahead, Keith. What do you think?
Oh, okay. Well, first, I'm noticing from what both Katie and Oliver have, and you actually have said, is that the real questions that I think everybody is grappling with is how you can use AI effectively as an assistant to the human writer or creator. I think, a lot of the times people are loosely thinking, well, AI is going to completely replace people and just like do it. And there are domains where that's can actually happen at the level of taking your job away. But particularly for creative writing, as Katie just said, there are ways to explore how you can use the AI in conjunction with the human. So, putting on my hat as a psychologist for a second, in the psychology of creativity, there's an emphasis on the question is, what's creative? Well, something novel and something that has value in some very general sense to somebody. But in addition, there's kind of a creative process that seems kind of especially human. And I think actually everyone else has alluded to it already, which is the sense that we create things out of emotion, out of our internal consciousness. And if you sort of think of like, well, how does a human create anything? You have to look at their whole life. So every individual is unique. And one reason is that essentially your life happens, things happen to you, you react to it, you read things, have experiences, emotions, even traumas, and of course, in some cases. And all of that leaves a residue in your memory so that at some later point you get bits and pieces of memories that you can potentially put together. And no two people, even if they had very similar experiences, are going to have the same package, basically, of ingredients. So the human creativity is kind of like finding that stuff, which is actually associated with a neural network that goes on when we loosely say we're daydreaming and mind wandering. It's kind of what we're really often doing, especially creative people, is kind of mulling over some kind of creative project and looking for things that sort of associate with it. So I think that's kind of useful to keep in mind, because the costs and benefits of AI are the extent to which you can sort of keep the human creativity element and augment it without actually basically stamping it out, which I think is the downside risk, which I think Oliver alluded to in particular. And here there's actually, just in the last year, been a number of actual psychological studies, which at least I think are worth pondering. One very basic result that's been seen in now several studies, both with writing and with painting, is that if you tell people this thing was generated by AI, they immediately don't like it as much. And although I don't think anyone's formally determined why, I suspect it's because, as was already suggested, when you get a piece of art or writing, part of your aesthetic experience is thinking about the human process behind it. That's partly why we're interested in the lives of artists or writers that we're interested in. And if you're told, well, there was none, it was just the AI, you kind of lost something right away, and it starts to feel like a kind of quasi-plagiarism or something, which is not as interesting. Another very recent study, which is I think of relevance here as kind of a caution, actually, is well, roughly you can think, whereas each human is unique because of their life experiences and emotion, to a first approximation, the AI had no experiences whatsoever. All it did was predict words in text. It's learned whatever it learned, but it's not nuanced by emotional context or anything like that. And in fact, there's this kind of rough general critique of AI products is that they have no soul, which roughly, they don't express personality because they haven't got a personality. They just, which is okay in sort of, applications like, writing a good real estate ad or something where you don't necessarily want to have any personality, you just want to get it done. But for true creative writing, that's a big problem. So the study I was going to mention is actually with writing. They took sort of just normal people who signed up for this, not real writers, and asked them to write a little story. I think it was about a venture at sea. And some of them just wrote it. Others had the opportunity to ask ChatGPT for some suggestions, like what would be a good rough plot summary for a venture at sea. And they also measured the creativity of each person. Some people are more creative than others. They have, wider free associations. So if you take the people who just did it all by themselves, normal style, there's a range of creativity when people then judge their product, their story, without knowing its origin. Anyhow, the more creative people wrote more creative stories, as you might expect. Now the other people were allowed to ask ChatGPT for prompts. So overall, their stories were judged as more creative. And in fact, the difference between the less creative and the more creative people just evaporated. Like everybody was looking like they're at the more creative end. So that, on the face of it sounds pretty good. Like we've made everybody creative. But the first cautionary note is that the most creative people did not get more creative with the help of the AI. They were just the same. The others kind of caught up, but the best did not get better. The other thing is they did a more detailed analysis of exactly how did everybody get more creative. And it's a bit commonsensical, but of course, what you can do is see how often did the people write this kind of story the AI suggested. So, some people just wrote that kind of story on their own, but basically the people who got AI suggestions wrote stories that used them. And what that means is that their stories all start to get rather similar. They're the AI generate. The AI basically knows all the sea adventure stories that have ever been written. It throws out some plots, and now each individual might look like they got more creative, but the group hasn't actually gained anything. And in fact, everything is getting more homogenized. So I think, the thing that I think is important to keep in mind as writers start using AI assistants, can you do it in a way that kind of leaves that human element, the individuality, and be careful basically not to have it wiped out by kind of like prematurely jumping to the AI suggestion. And I guess maybe one more thing to add, I think it relates to, I think Oliver's mentioned like the English professors and what are they going to do? And I think it's fair to say that expert writers who have already good writers could benefit significantly from careful use of AI assistance, just as Katie was saying. And if you think of it, the kind of AI we're talking about has been around for about 2 years. So all of us are adults at various life stages, some of us further along than others. But we all, already learned to write or to do whatever creative things we can do. And that's great. Now we can augment it in certain ways. But, imagine the kids in grade 1 who are just starting out. Are they ever going to learn to write at all? It's become, it's very easy to take ChatGPT, which is going to be better than a young child or even a college student sometimes doing a routine essay. Are they going to use it instead? So the danger being that it's kind of over time, we kind of collectively get AI dependent. In fact, there's also studies, by the way, that show that you add the AI assistants, you get better. Take away the AI assistants, and you're just back where you started. Like you haven't really learned something that you could do on your own. You've just used the AI to kind of pull you up. So the danger is that becomes so widespread. We can have analogies. I mean, a generation ago, kids learned handwriting in school. But then, typing and computers and word processing came along, and handwriting seems fairly useless, and schools don't teach it much. And I guess people don't handwrite very well anymore. And it doesn't, I suppose, matter tremendously because, okay, we don't need it anymore. But then you have to, but what about human creative thinking? Somehow you feel like there could be something truly lost if that gets blocked in the end by kind of premature and over dependence on AI.
Yeah, for sure. That last point you're making about the handwriting, I've thought about that because I have children, and it wasn't taught at their school, and I just made them do it.
Right.
Because I read, and I'm sorry, I don't remember a study that there is a connection between, like for humans, it's important for us to move our hands. There's a connection between what we write and then how it connects to how we think.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't want them to miss out on that connection. And they turned out all right. But that goes back to what I was bringing up in the beginning about Chesterton's fence, which is when you get rid of something, there's downstream effects that if you just get rid of it without thinking about why you're getting rid of it, just like, it's kind of convenient, or, we have this new tech. I think we should think about it, which goes to my answer about how is AI affecting creative writers. In preparation for this event, I did a little recognizance, and I attended or reconnaissance. I got the word wrong. Some events about this topic, and weirdly, I attended 3, And weirdly, none of them actually wanted to address the topic. They were all, I have to say, afraid. They didn't want to talk about it. And only at the end, and one of them, like they danced around it. They didn't define it. That's why I wanted to start with a definition. They didn't say, their hopes about it, because we've heard a lot of hopeful things here, and this is good. And I think it's because they had so much fear. That's the only way I could interpret what happened. And only in one, the last one I attended via Zoom, someone raised their hand, probably at the end they did this probably because they were wondering why there's the title of AI in this panel discussion, and it wasn't brought up. It was very odd. And so it was a student like, what about this? And they all were silent on the panel, so thankfully none of you are. And they were just looking at each other. I could see them on the Zoom, just looking at each other because they were in person, and I was zooming in. And then finally someone just said, yeah, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. And that was essentially, she went on a little bit after that, but essentially that was the answer. And my feeling was there's just a lot of fear around this. So we need to talk it out so that, all the good that could come from it comes from it. And all the, the things that were the unspoken fears don't just manifest, and sweep us down the toilet bowl, of history, or even just we lose something like in the case of handwriting, where we don't know what we're losing when we don't practice that, putting our thoughts down with our hands and connecting our thoughts with our body more closely, because that's what happens. Although typing does that, and I guess so does using your thumbs, but not as much as forming each letter. I according to the study that I don't remember what it was, but according to that. So I think it's good that we're talking this out. And my hope is that in the chat, like as we're going to keep talking, but in the chat, all of you that are out there, please put your questions or even your fears. Maybe we can address some of those during the Q&A time. But now I want to turn to the next question. I think someone mentioned this. I can't remember which of the panelists mentioned publishing. So how will AI change publishing? And I think, Oliver, you mentioned the writer's strike, the screenwriter's strike that went on recently and was just very recently resolved. But what about in the realm of prose and poetry publishing? What do you think?
Is this to me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah, I can certainly answer it. So I am a contributing editor for the Canyon Review, and also for the Tupelo Quarterly Review. Those are the two magazines that I work on, and in my capacity as a contributing editor, part of my job is to read thousands and thousands of manuscripts. We have, in both iterations, instituted an AI policy, which is we don't accept it. Now, the question is, how do we know it's AI and how do we know it's not AI? I don't know. But I think that this is sort of the industry preliminarily setting up rules or guideposts for itself moving forward. I think, though, as Keith had mentioned, this is still a very young technology, as he had mentioned, 2 years old. I think we're still in the mud right now as far as knowing and not being able to identify what's AI and what isn't. And even AI sometimes isn't able to identify what AI is. So I can tell you that a lot of what publishing is doing is establishing preliminary ground rules for what may happen. And again, that's what I'm seeing in my limited capacity as a contributing editor.
Okay, Katie, I know you're also an editor of several different magazines, One Art and Rattle, and also the NFT poetry. So what do you think?
Well, I know for Rattle, we officially have the guideline that we do not accept work that is predominantly generated by artificial intelligence. But I would go so far as to say, so Rattle gets about 250,000 poems submitted a year. And it's very apparent when it is an AI poem. For one thing, it's, usually quatrains and in rhymes, which fortunately is not the bulk of the normal submissions that we receive. So I'm not overly concerned about that. I think plagiarism, for example, is a much bigger problem than an AI poem getting through. I also personally have this kind of belief that if AI can actually write a poem that's good enough to be published in Rattle, then good for AI. I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening ever, to be honest, but definitely not anytime soon. But I did want to say more hopefully in terms of looking at how to field, places that get this large volume of submissions. I'm really excited because I think that we could train an AI to go through the slush for the first reading. I'm not sure exactly how you would set the parameters, but for example, if a poem has 3 or more common cliches, probably not going to end up, being picked to be published in the end. And there are a lot of ways that you could say, this is very unlikely to be a poem that works. And then that could be amazing for journals that are fielding a large number of submissions. And that would be great for writers because guess what? They wouldn't have to wait 6 months to hear back about their poem or their story, right? So I'm really excited about that. And then the other way that I think it can revolutionize publishing is through helping self-published manuscripts be far more professional. I'm a big believer in us getting our own poems or stories out there. And if we can do that in a more professional way, I think that will encourage poets and writers to go ahead and get their work out there when they can look to an AI to even do things like suggest edits to their own poems, which, hey, a lot of times you're going to reject, but at least you're thinking critically about different things you could do.
Okay, great. Yeah. Keith, what do you think?
Let's see, a couple of things. Picking up on what Oliver had mentioned earlier, one aspect, of course, is what's going on with the use of actual human writing to train AI, which indeed lots of people have problems with. And in fact, there's lawsuits flying all over the place. Probably the most well-known is the New York Times versus OpenAI for having stolen the entire New York Times. I can say that it's tough. I think Oliver threw up the possibility of take all your stuff off the internet. Okay, well, if you take all your stuff off the internet, you're kind of dooming yourself to total obscurity in our modern world. That's tough. And just last week, because I publish sometimes with the MIT Press, which is a well-known university press, but a nonprofit, they actually just are polling the authors of whether they should go forth and try to negotiate deals with OpenAI and similar companies to, in essence, license the use of the works of MIT Press, asking us questions as authors like, would you want to have an opt-out or opt-in clause? Do you think you should be getting some of the money, or are you just going to let the press use it as a nonprofit? I mean, clearly that's what actually is happening in the publishing world right now. My sense is it's either going to be stolen or you can try and sell it for a little money and at least get the little money for it. Now, on the other end, the question of what about the products of AI? How are we supposed to treat that in the publishing world? I think one issue that is worth pointing out is simply copyright law. The U.S. Copyright Office, has complicated criteria for what's copyrightable, but in broad strokes, it's something that has some kind of minimal standard of creativity. There's got to be some creative effort, and that rules certain things out as like not creative enough. And in the United States, as I understand it, and one of my grad students happens to be working on this kind of stuff, it's undecided at this moment whether the product of an AI is copyrightable at all. In Europe, I believe it is decided, and the answer is no, which means that if you put some AI-generated work out, anybody can do anything they like with it, period, because no human or computer program has any copyright protection over it. So anyhow, that's at least a legal issue to keep in mind. And then, I mean, how to tell whether it is AI or partly AI? I mean, it's an arms race between the AIs that are producing it and the AIs that are checking it. And I suppose, I really don't know. But compromises are clearly emerging. So in scientific writing, so as scientists, we're writing research reports on our experiments, and they're not creative writing. In fact, they're sort of standardized, like fair, certain formats supposed to be short and so on. People are certainly experimenting with using AI assistants as scientists to generate their research reports. And the rough guidelines that are emerging is that that's sort of okay as long as you disclose it. I just saw a paper, this is as a study, where some psychologists fine-tuned the AI model on their own collective works. And then having tuned the model on their own collective works, they write their next scientific paper in their style, which was determined in the past. And in fact, I think, more broadly, anybody who's kind of an established writer and has their own collective works has the opportunity, for better or worse, and it could be worse, but they could then fine-tune a model on themselves. And let's suppose in the later part of their career, when the creative juices are not flowing so well, they could continue to produce in the style that they had established in when they were young Turks or whatever. So really, there's going to be a whole lot of this very gray area of work that's been AI assisted to different degrees. And I'm glad I'm not the one who's has to try and tell it apart exactly.
I like how you put it. It's an arms race between the AI that is
Well,
writing
yeah, I
and
mean,
the AI that's detecting the AI.
ChatGPT came out in like December 22, and within a month, kids are turning in essays at college. And, within a month and a half, companies have come up saying, oh, we've got the detector that will, some new version of Turnitin, which will find AI plagiarism. And within 2 months, those models were obsolete because the AI was better than that at fooling them. So, yeah. I don't believe there's any reliable methods. And of course, you hear horror stories where some poor kid is accused of AI cheating when in fact they wrote it all totally on their own.
Oh, yeah.
Although, I mean, I've also heard, I don't know, maybe Oliver the AI, well, this is true. I've heard there are English professors who give higher marks if there are grammatical mistakes in the papers because that suggests that it was really honest human work.
Not in my department.
Okay, yeah, that's probably just a story, but yeah.
Oh, wow. So I want to add to all that, because you mentioned lawsuits and things like that. I just, so that everybody knows, Authors Guild of America has drafted language that you can borrow, and they say, borrow it from us. We put this language together. If you want to put it, an addition into your contract when you get your book published, which I did. I have 2 forthcoming books, and I put the language in there that says, do not use this. I forbid this material to be used to train AI, learning models, and yeah. So you can do that too, all of you. Just look up Authors Guild of America, and you could refine it however you want. And I just did that because I was working. I worked with collaborative projects, and I didn't want to have that happen to all these other people. I mean, for the anthology I was working with, it's, gosh, how many writers? Like 150 writers. So I just thought, let's just be safe and just cover all the bases and not have their work, even though it's been translated into English. But even on the Arabic side, input into these this new novel technology, until they've had a chance to think about it because it's so new. For myself, I think I'd rather not also. But more it was because of the my collaborators.
I mean,
Um,
it seems very sensible, but just to pursue the dark side,
yeah,
how do you think you're going to enforce this?
no,
Like,
no, you're
um,
right. Yeah, not yet.
yeah,
I mean, but we're in, this is an interesting question, but we're innovative, we're adaptable as humans, and we can, I mean, that's why I was thinking about what you said about the arms race, because
yeah.
if we can create the AI, we can create the AI detectors. And even and Oliver, you probably have used this. Isn't there isn't there some kind of program where you can detect, it's called turnitin.com, I remember now, where you can detect plagiarism. I used to use that when I was teaching comp for many years. I don't know if you've ever used that, but
Yeah, but it's not great, right? I
no,
mean, it's not
no,
great. It's only as good as its human makers make it.
yeah,
And so, I mean, I think that, and they added an AI feature, find AI feature on that particular
yeah,
site. But again, it's not perfect, and I
yeah,
think that you know, it's sort of like it is an arms race. It is sort of, things are moving and changing very, very fast, and with these very fast changes, I think that the speed of human ingenuity is also um, creating and trying to solve various problems that arise from this technology that we've created. I mean, I see I see sort of our ingenuity in regards to this particular idea or field is very similar to sort of rhizomatic tendrils sort of rising from the ground and sort of making new pathways.
mhm,
And I think that what we're going to see is just us creatively as a humanity, sort of creating new pathways in some way, shape, or form.
yeah. I think that the new pathways might, at least one main one, will head towards transparency. I think that that's a real big key, because if even if we can't keep up, being transparent, I think will create a divide that's good, I think. And I heard this from Katie, your colleague, Tim Green, on one of the poetry spaces. I remember he said something like, the people who like human generated work will just gravitate towards that. And then the people who don't, or are okay, maybe not don't, but they're okay with the other, they'll go for the other, and they'll just be sort of genres created. And I'm sorry, Tim, if I'm misquoting you, but I remember it was something like that. And I started thinking about that, and I thought, yeah, if we just make a high priority transparency, then things can flow from there. Just let us know if this is, if my work is being used in this way, or let us know if you've generated this or you used an AI assist. Like, just let people know, and I think that becomes part of the story in a good way. And yeah, and people can just consume what they want to consume and be okay with it. What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I mean, we really need more transparency, especially in poetry. So that's exciting to me. And I've been thinking about, to me, AI is asking us all, what does it mean to be human? Or what does
Yeah,
it mean to be creative? What does it mean to be intelligent? Like, these are really exciting questions. And the fact is, we want that human side of it. Like Keith was talking about the potential of a program giving bonus points for grammatical mistakes. That would be my program. That was
yeah,
I would really succeed in that. But there's that quest for authenticity. And I mean, as a poetry editor, I feel like I'm basically scanning for authenticity when I read. And when I really connect with a poem, it's because it's really authentic. So I think that AI highlights what it is to be human. It doesn't lessen it or degrade it in some way. It makes us quest more to be human.
hmm. Yes, yeah, I agree. So what do you all think about? I mean, you're kind of addressing a fear. That's what we're kind of addressing, some of the fears. But what do you think are some fears that we haven't gotten to that people have, and then we could address them, or maybe admit that it's a wait and see kind of situation. Because again, I'm thinking back on those other programs that I went to, and people were so afraid, and it's understandable because change is scary, and ambiguity can be scary. But what can we say here? Throw it back on all of you to address some of these fears, anticipate and address some of these fears. And yeah, Oliver, do you have?
I think that my one fear is a fear of disinterest, if that makes sense, right? It's not necessarily from the maker's perspective. I'm not afraid. I'm not worried about how this would affect my ability to create. I know myself, and I very much enjoy this process of making. The worry, though, is the sheer volume that might be out there generated through this means that creates a disinterested audience, right? Like that if we sort of flatten, and I think Keith mentioned this, if we flatten what the work looks like so that it all looks sort of like it's been spat out via algorithm, what happens to the reader? What happens to readers in the future moving forward if there is sort of a distrust of the authenticity of something made? That's the worry. Again, though, I'm looking at this from the perspective of a maker who likes the practice of making and creating, and even using tools like AI. I'm not afraid of using AI. I just worry that essentially what we are doing is we're creating generations who for them art is sort of flattened out. I don't think that that's necessarily in our future, but I think that is, I'm anticipating that that's a fear that a lot of my colleagues might have in the creative arts.
Okay. Yeah, Katie, what do you think? You've addressed some of them already, but any other further fears?
Sure. I suppose it is. I feel so positively on this subject that this is actually probably the hardest
Yeah.
topic for me, which is funny because like you were saying, I mean, I was listening to podcasts too, and the podcast for the poetry space we did on AI, it became like this doomsday type experience where everyone was fearing the Terminator, because that was like a year and a half ago. And I feel like the outlook is a lot more positive. I guess I would say I think some people are concerned, about the competition. But for me, as a poker player, I welcome competition, and I view it as, maybe we need something to make us better as writers. And if there is writing that is not creative enough or better served as being written by AI, I don't think that we need to be overly concerned sometimes with being human, if that makes sense, because then maybe those people who would be writing, maybe technical writing, maybe there will be a bigger market for creative writing, and they get to write maybe what they wanted, to be writing all along. So I think the competition, it's always hard when a market becomes difficult, and people will lose jobs. And of course, that is sad. But I hope that they find a brighter future if that comes to pass.
That's so interesting. I never thought of that framing, that people might be seeing it as it's competition to what they're doing, and that they fear that the competition is better, and it does drive us further inward to that authentic space. It does make us yeah, I think you said that, make us try to figure out what is my humanness, what is my uniqueness, and how can I express this in this art. Keith, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I sort of agree with what everyone has been saying. I mean, someone just told me today, they're talking to a creative director or something, and they want to have nothing to do with AI, and basically because they like doing the work and don't want to turn it over. And I think back, 10, 20 years ago, and if we were anticipating some future AI utopia, roughly what we expect is we'd like to have this AI robot who was like fixing our kitchen plumbing problems while meanwhile we do our art and poetry. But here we are, it's just the opposite. The AI is happy to do the art and poetry, but we're still on our own fixing the plumbing, because it turns out physical robotics is way harder than creative writing, actually, for computer systems. And I think I mentioned earlier that people tend to devalue artwork that they believe is AI generated. There's an extra tweak there. Those people who in one way or another seem like they were more humanists, that they thought that the creative process was like really personally important to them, they really devalued the AI more than others. And personally, I guess now speaking more as a poet than my other more scientific aspects, I mean, particularly with poetry, I think of it as kind of the most humanistic of all the, at least literary art forms, where basically the point of the poem is that a human got to express their emotion and their idiosyncratic point of view in some interesting language as the output. And so if some product is produced, which I might think is all very good and so on, but no poetry writing has happened in this generation. To me, that's just detracting from sort of the mission of creative human beings. So I guess that's kind of like the downside risk that I like personally relate to.
Hmm. Yeah, the downside that I think of the most is the fear that folks will stop learning how to think. Just the process of thinking
Well, a good
will
point. And in fact,
disappear.
well, I mean, again, this relates to the worry about, what happens with the new generations. Because again, we're the old timers. We remember prehistory before ChatGPT. But if everyone went through all the difficult stages of learning. You're not very good when you start. You make mistakes and it's boring and it's whatever. There's things wrong with it. And now imagine that raw beginner who now sees ChatGPT producing something like 10 times better than what they can do today. It's discouraging. In fact, I meant at some point, I don't know if some of you know Nick Cave, who's a singer-songwriter from Australia. He's now famous in the cognitive science community for being the earliest and most vociferous critic of ChatGPT, exactly because he's used to be a hardcore punk rocker, had a tough life, writes out of trauma, out of personal trauma and emotion intensely. And I got one little quote from, for those interested, you can Google him. He has a blog called The Red Hand Files, where he answers questions from his readers. And some of his readers have said, "Oh, great, I've produced a Nick Cave song with ChatGPT." And he was not pleased. And one thing he said is, "There are all sorts of temptations in this world that will eat away at your creative spirit, but none more fiendish than that boundless machine of artistic demoralization, ChatGPT." So that's a worry.
Yeah. Yeah, with my fear of the process of thinking, as you said, for the younger generations, not for all of us here, those coming up, is that one way that we know our fears as humanity is through science fiction writing. And if we can't project into the future and learn how to think ahead, and try to figure out what could come down the pike, we will be in trouble. We won't catch things like we're catching it now, because I think a lot of the fears that we're all having now are through, I think someone mentioned, I think Katie, you said the Terminator. Or the Matrix, or any of these other dystopians that could happen. And personally, my hope is that we're more towards the Star Trek realm than anything else. But in order to get there, we do have to maintain our thinking. And I think if we catch it through conversations like these, we'll all be fine. I'm really happy that everybody is pretty positive here and not afraid to address things, and not afraid to name and address fears, because that's how you take care of business as humans. So now what I want to do is open things up to questions from those who are with us. We have a few minutes left, and I'm interested in the thoughts you've been having, the questions. Let's see, some of them are right there in the chat. And I'll ask from there, but also feel free to raise your hand too if you feel like you want to do that. What about, so David Camper asks, what about using fine-tuned models on specific types of poetry, including free verse versus specific metrical patterns? Yeah, that's something very interesting. I think you can isolate. I think that goes to the point of prompts. Am I right? Goes to the point of prompts. If you can use the AI as an assistant, that especially with formal poetry, they do have, I've seen formal poets have charts that they use, but this could be something that could free up your mind to create and think about the content, and then check yourself via the AI assist with the metrical. But any of our panelists have anything to add?
I just say that so far, I know some people do try to use it to check their meter in a formal poem, and it's definitely not perfect there. But something that's fun, I think, is to input a poem, and then let's say you input a sestina and ask ChatGPT to try to write it as a villanelle. And you can just, as long as you stay critical and looking at it, you might say like, I really like that line break, or look how they varied that. So it's a really fun process to involve it with formal poetry. I think has a lot of potential.
Speaking as someone who likes to write formal poetry, I've found it fundamentally useless. So I can't, one thing maybe not so well known about ChatGPT and its language cousins is they're very bad at math. And for real math applications, there's lots of fixes going on now. But what I've noticed is related to the check your meter. They're basically very bad at counting. They can manage to count lines, but as far as I can tell, it cannot count syllables, far less metrical patterns over syllables. It's kind of by default, it gives you these dumb rhyming couplets, which seems to be a summary of English poetry over the last couple of thousand years. But the meter is terrible. I don't think it can even write, clean iambic if you ask it to, although I haven't really experimented carefully. But let me throw in something I meant to mention, and it's, I guess, a little related here. There's a psychology study has just been published today. That's why I have on my mind, where they fine-tuned, I guess, ChatGPT 3.5 on no, they didn't fine-tune it. They simply prompted it to write a poem in the style of and about 10 famous poets, Walt Whitman and so on. Then they gave the AI-generated Walt Whitmans and real Walt Whitmans to kind of, roughly speaking, regular people who I would say didn't know much about poetry, not very interested in poetry, didn't read very poetry, kind of naive, and asked them, which one do you like better for the gut ratings? So basic findings are, number one, they like the AI Walt Whitman better than the actual Walt Whitman. And this is true for basically all the poem. And that appeared to be because the AI kind of simplified things, gave you sort of an average, and that made it easier to understand what the theme is, sort of less mental work. At the same time, if you then told the person, this is an AI poem, and maybe it was, and maybe it was actually human, but whatever it really was, they like it less. They say they like it less if you tell them it's AI, but if you don't tell them it's AI, they actually prefer the AI poems because they sort of are simpler and easier to understand. So anyhow, I'm not sure where that takes us.
Well, I would say that is a good spur to us contemporary poets to write better poems, because I do think we have a problem with a lack of accessible poetry. So I would say that's more of a great example of how this can, cause us to become better poets, because there is work to do. Though I have to say, I would be interested, to go back to 1850 and hand those people the same test. And I mean, it's not really fair to judge Whitman now versus then. I mean, so much of what he did is the lineage of what he did versus the individual poems.
Yeah. By the way, that example is it sort of comes up in thinking about the possible limits of AI creativity. Imagine we did train the model on all the poetry up to 1850 and then asked it to start just generating poems. Would 20th century modernism be created? And although this has not been run, I'm quite confident the answer is absolutely not.
Oh yeah, there
That
would be a lot taken
it's
out.
always going to be, what it's basically doing is always giving you back something in the general range of what it's already experienced. It isn't taking you the next step. Likewise, give it all the art up to 1850. Is it going to go forward and invent modern art in its various manifestations, or the same with music? Would you come up with the Beatles if you stopped training it at 1850?
Yeah,
And
I
the answer
I
is
don't see
obviously
that.
not. And I think that gap is where the human creativity really remains like the only game in town.
Well, it's also missing a ton, like ginormous amounts of context. Like
Yes, yes,
everything in the world affected those things to happen. And if you're
exactly.
just inputting words, you're just getting a style and you want it to result in another style. It's as if world wars haven't happened and,
Right.
diseases haven't ravaged populations and all kinds of things. So we have I'm going to go to one of the raised hands and then I'll get back to the questions in the chat. So we have Stephanie, you have your hand raised there.
Thank you all for this really great discussion. I think first off, I'm really happy to also hear like the positive association with AI and also, what some of the concerns are. Um, I think I've also been thinking about accumulation with AI, and how much is like even my own usage of AI. I'm like the amount of chat history that's already being created in the same way that we Google things forever. Um, how that is affecting, let's say, even submissions or, to publications or anything like that. But then also one thing that I feel from the internet, if that makes sense, is fatigue and burnout around so much reading and so much like information. And so if I had a fear, a concern, a worry, is like how AI is, how are we going to combat that as humans, like not being burnt out? And I just was curious to see how you guys were thinking about it as well.
Yeah, would any of you like to take that?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure this is quite on target. I mean, yeah, there's just more and more stuff on the internet, and it's all half of it is crazy and wrong, and that's a big problem in general. But specifically with AI, another kind of worry on the horizon, and there's even a concept of it, is degenerative AI, the opposite of generative. So the OpenAI and the other companies are kind of up against a big problem right now because they've trained their models on, roughly speaking, the entire internet. And now what? They would like to have even bigger and better models. But there is no more, at least they're not getting human generated stuff. So first thing is happening, of course, is the internet that used to be human generated, because we were the ones who put stuff out. Some was good, some was bad, but it was all human generated. Now there's AI generated stuff getting into the internet as well. So if you were to retrain your model, it would no longer be being trained solely on human generated text, but it's a part on AI generated text. And people have been doing experiments, and they roughly show that each generation of AI generated material, whether it's words or art or whatever, gets more homogeneous. It's similar to what I said before. In fact, a nice example, you can do it with human faces. Current AI can generate human faces that are completely indistinguishable from a real human face. I mean, nobody can tell the difference. Suppose you take an AI that's that good, let it generate millions of AI generated faces, Now train it all over again on just its AI generated faces. So that's generation one, and you can repeat. And when basically, as generations go, what started out as like a nice set of indistinguishable from human faces starts to get blurry. They start to get more similar until ultimately, if you keep going, they collapse into some little circular blob or something. It's the only thing left. So roughly speaking, the danger is that as we add AI content out there, everything gets homogenized, including the AI models. So instead of getting better with more training, they might get worse. Um, you know, the AI people are trying to grapple with this like right now, and I don't know whether they'll succeed in finding a way, or maybe there's a new kind of AI that is not so dependent on massive amounts of training data, but it's certainly an issue that's front and center right now.
I could see that coming back around for writing as well.
Oh
That
yeah.
things start blurry in how it would be expressed through writing, and then also the flattening out, which I think Oliver also mentioned that could happen in the same way that accents have been flattened out because we hear each other so often, you know, uh, across the nation. So regional accents are starting to disappear. I want to point to someone in the chat, Michael, I believe, brought up a concern about AI being a first reader, because I thought that was an interesting idea. And so Oliver and Katie, you both are editors at magazines. I've also been an editor at various magazines, Consequence and Mur and Talking Writing, bunch of magazines. So I might chime in on this. But Oliver and Katie, what do you think about this concern? Michael says, terrified of thinking that first reads at journals might not be humans, even if they're undergrads or grads without tons of experience. Poetry is a means of communicating between humans. I don't love the idea of being read by a machine. Perhaps as a teacher, former editor, I have a stake in working with readers to discuss what merits praise or not. I think that's interesting, even though initially I was like, ooh, cool. But that's an interesting concern. So what do you two think?
I'm not surprised that it's controversial to go ahead and say that. I mean, I know that as a poet, we're looking for a human connection, human experience. It's not something I would have said before I started reading a large volume of submissions. I think that, there are costs to things and then there are benefits, right? So I think that the benefits are immense for poets. It is really hard to send out a poem and wait possibly a year to hear back. And it's a crisis in poetry. I'm not as familiar with flash fiction or prose in general, but in poetry, it's a real problem. And so I think we need to look for those solutions and then think about, the cost to it. Of course, also for journals, it's expensive, even if it's just, time of undergrads or volunteers. These are people with lives who would be doing something else that, can also then focus on the poems later down the road. I'd also say that allowing rejections of work that is, the kind of work I'm talking about is, work that has 5 cliches in it, where the person probably has not read a contemporary poem written by someone else ever. These are the kinds of submissions I'm talking about fielding out. And so I'm all for the human touch. I send way too many personalized rejections, way more than I have time for. And I'm all for that. And I understand the concern, but I would say, all the benefits it could offer, particularly to large journals, are immense.
Before I throw it over to Oliver, I just want to ask, so you mentioned a few things. You said cliches. I don't know how easy that would be to identify, and what kind of inputs, because you talked about prompts in the beginning, so you have to, there's creativity in the prompting. So so that would be one thing I guess you would try to prompt for, but what other things besides that? I don't know if you could check. I get the sentiment that you're saying about this person hasn't read. I can tell because you're a professional practiced poet, publishing poet and editor. So you do know, okay, it's evident this person hasn't read things, but how would an AI, how would you prompt for that? Well, you don't have to answer that. I'm really more asking what other things that you could more easily prompt for.
Well, first, I'd like to say you could go ahead and you could even post these publicly. Like we're talking about more transparency in poetry and stuff. And you could literally say, because so few people actually read the submission guidelines, but you could put on there, our first reader scans for this. If you have this in your poem, it will not make it to the second reading. So first of all, that's something that could happen right there. And then it might be helpful to people starting out too, because it would be basically a list of things that are so heavily correlated with a poem that is not going to make it to the second round that you can be pretty much sure. So you could do things like a point against would be a center aligned poem. Or, I have seen ChatGPT able to pick up on cliches like it does. So you could search, if it contains bleeding heart, if it contains, and the thing is, I know that you have to be really careful, right? Because you could have a poem that's about idioms, for example, which is actually a prompt I've done before to turn an idiom on its head. So you'd have to be really careful and put a lot of skill and time into it. But with transparency, I think it could also read as a guide, like a beginner's guide to submitting. You probably
rubric.
don't want 5 cliches in your poem. You probably don't want to center align it and all these things that can be frustrating to hear as someone who submits, but in reality are heavily correlated with the kind of person who hasn't read a lot of poems, which in general is going to be the kind of person who's not writing publication quality poems yet.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
going to speak to what Katie said. I mean, I think that's right. That basically the point that she made is exactly right. That if it is going to be a tool that's going to be used as a first screener, it's going to be very clear to all submitters that this is an instrument that is going to be sort of the first line. And, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to figure out whether or not a packet is going to be good or ready or what have you. And that will basically be one, if they follow the submission guidelines. If you have a submission that does not follow the submission guidelines, I think that's an automatic AI can screen for that, and that's okay. I think when it digs down to the further bits of like what a manuscript looks like and other things, I think that we start to get tricky in terms of like how to program the machine. But I will say, as somebody who has seen the slush pile at Kenyon, it would be useful. We get roughly, in any year, just poetry submissions alone, 10,000 poetry submissions. And that's divided up among a whole bunch of readers. But the problem is that it's never enough time. And then the next series of pieces comes out. And I think that the way that Katie put it is really a healthy way to look at it. That like you can also see this rejection tool as a good way to kick you back into play and make you go back to work. For those of you who are just sort of waiting with bated breath for that notification, hey, maybe it's okay and useful that you've gotten your feedback and it's in this form. And that tells you, maybe I have to hit a certain standard with my work. That's okay. That's useful feedback. Now, it isn't feedback that is necessarily directly generated from a person, but a person programmed that particular device or that instrument to tell you something. So, I mean, I think in this way, I'm okay with it. I just think that also there are ways that we're still going to need to get human hands and human eyes on certain things, sort of as a check, right? As a check. Sometimes AI might miss things and we might actually have to go back. So, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Keith. Do you want to add?
Oh, well, kind of putting it in a more general context, whether we think this is good or bad, this is merely a little example of what's happening all over the place in all kinds of contexts. AI is used as the initial screen. You might be worried that a human didn't read your poem before they get rejected. Well, how about your, Tim Green just put it up. How about your job applications? There's an awful lot of job applications for a lot of jobs. How about those college admissions essays that you and your parents and your paid consultant labored over for a year? When a school gets 250,000 of those applicants, do we really think that humans are going to be the first screeners all the time? And I should say, I think Tim also flashed this up in the chat, that with respect specifically to the literary applications that's being talked about, you don't need to program in your criteria. In fact, that's probably not even a good idea. You take last year's batch of submissions and with decisions, and you now fine tune your model. Well, these are the ones that we rejected right away. These were kind of long listed, and these ones really made it. And it'll learn implicitly. And I bet it'll do as roughly as well as a human editor, given the current state of the art. And not only that, this needs to be tested, and it's just kind of conjecture, but these models can also write explanations. So you wouldn't have said anything to the one that you were rejecting, because you haven't got time to deal with it. It probably can tell you that this poem has got more cliches than it ought to, without you having programmed it to know that, but it would have figured it out from looking at all the examples of the ones that were flat out rejected last year. So yeah, I'm afraid, for better or for worse, things like this are the future for decision making at scale.
Yes, I agree. And that's a great place to end. We have arrived at the end of our discussion here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Oliver had to leave right away. He said his very real children are hollering for him and dinner. So he went. But thank you so much, Keith and Katie. Your input was fabulous. This was just a beginning conversation. For everyone else, we'll be sending out the questions that didn't get answered so that everyone can ponder them. And we'll also be sending you the video so you can forward it to other people who didn't make it to our discussion. And then you can continue the discussion with them on your own. I want to encourage everyone to click the link in the chat that enables you to receive the 24 Pearl Street newsletter, which lets you know about discounts. I mentioned the 20% off student teacher discount that you can receive this fall for applying for any of our fall classes. And you can learn about Fine Arts Work Center in general. Feel free to email me, Jennifer Jean, at jjean@fawc.org if you have feedback or more questions, or you want to make a suggestion for a future free community event through the Fine Arts Work Center. So thank you all so much, and I bid you all farewell. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you,
Bye.
Keith. Thanks, everybody.